or afternoon for where everyone's located. I'm Matt Solomon. I'm a manager at Eide Bailey in the cybersecurity services. I usually focus on the more proactive of cybersecurity. We're doing things like risk assessment, security awareness training. We're trying to do the proactive and prevent, a breach or anything. Trent?
My name is Trent Levitt. I'm a digital forensics manager here at Eide Bailey, and kind of on the opposite side of what Matt does, where Matt is proactive, I'm more reactive in the work that I do. Anything from data breaches and figuring out how the threat actor, as we call them, got into the system, what they had access to, and then trying to get an understanding of what they took to mitigate that for legal reasons and for notification. I work in cases like intellectual property theft, and I have a background in digital forensics with the FBI in a former life. So happy to be with you guys today. So first and foremost, we'd like this to be a good discussion. Like Amy said, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A portion of this, and we'll do our best to get those things answered. If there's something that I don't know the answer to, or Matt doesn't know the answer to, then we will do our homework and get those answers for you. I personally don't claim to know everything that there is to know, so I'm happy to say that I don't know something, but I like to find the answers to it. It's one of the benefits of my job that I do. So we want to discuss today, the learning objectives are the benefits of working within the cloud, and review the risks that do come with working in a cloud environment, and then identifying different risks and myths of the cloud and kind of diffusing what's real and what's not when it comes to working in the cloud. So we want to discuss recent data breaches, different terminology, common myths, benefits of the cloud, and then those cloud risks. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to talk about some different data breaches that have taken place.
Thanks, Trent. So we always like to usually start some of these as, just some war stories kind of things of different incidents or breaches that have been in the news or we've investigated. I did just choose a few of these, and I did choose ones. Obviously, these are large companies that most people have heard of, kind of things. I just want to go down quick and just talk about these, but I do want to point out, we're obviously using these examples of major organizations. Everyone has heard of Facebook kind of thing. People have heard of Capital One, but this is happening not to just like major organizations. This, there are definitely cloud incidents and breaches and things like that for small organizations. I just really chose this because obviously when, something like a Facebook or some, Capital One that affects hundreds of millions of people, it usually makes the news versus, a smaller organization. But the Facebook incident that happened just over a year ago now, this was actually a third party of theirs that they use, but they were just using a cloud service provider, AWS, and they just pretty much was just a big large repository of information, and it was publicly accessible. It was wide open, so if you just happened to stumble upon it or you knew about it, you didn't need a password, you didn't need anything to access that information. And the same thing actually happened with Instagram. It was just an AWS thing that was done by a third party that was just wide open to the world. And we see a lot of these, and you've seen, I'm sure you've heard about it in the news before. It's just a lot of these incidents, or just something that's exposed to the internet. I mean, it wasn't a sophisticated hack. I mean, these are just wide open. I mean, it's just like having your front door open and expect someone never to stick their head in and see. That's where we see a lot of these kind of things with Facebook. There's 540 million records were exposed. So that included, information, maybe of phone numbers, addresses, things that were considered private. A Facebook account, could have been exposed, including some passwords. Instagram, same thing, email addresses, phone numbers, all of that personal information like that, if it was out in Instagram, was exposed. CenturyLink, it was the same exact thing, but it wasn't AWS. It was a different database system, but it was open to the world that exposed, mailing addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, account information. It was just wide open. Now the Capital One was a little bit different. It was still human error. It was a misconfigured firewall at the time for the web app. But this was a very large thing since it affected, 100 million individuals, which included social security numbers, included bank account numbers. And all of these, I mean, it was literally just what they had in common was just a setting. I mean, it wasn't a sophisticated hack. It was just they forgot to enable something. It was just literally a flick of a switch in the settings that could have prevented this. And that's where we see a lot of these incidents where it isn't a big sophisticated thing sometimes with the cloud. It's just someone forgot to do something. It was just misconfigured.
One thing I'll point out there, Matt, like let's use Facebook as an example. Facebook being a major organization, employs tens of thousands of people. They have an entire team and organization of security professionals, and they still get breached.
Yes.
And Matt, you and I have talked about this many times. For any organization, it's not a matter of if they're going to get breached, it's when. And that's kind of the mindset you need to have going into this, whether you're working in the cloud or not.
Definitely. So I definitely like this quote. This is by Gartner. They said, through 2025, 99% of cloud security failures will be the customer's fault rather than the service provider. And this is sort of, when people were starting to move to the cloud, everyone was always scared because they're like, well, what happens if Microsoft or Amazon, they do something, it causes me incident. Well, what we've seen over and over and over again has been, it's not, the service provider's fault. I mean, there has been some rare cases it has been, but when 99% of the time, and what we see from the statistic, it is the customers, a misconfiguration, things like that.
The last 3 data breaches that I've worked on, Matt, as we root back the cause of why it took place, all 3 of them, the root cause of it was a person's failure to do something, not a software failure or hardware failure. It was that of the person at the computer that was breached that caused that failure to take place in the organization.
Yeah, and we have seen that across the board. And now I will say what's good about a lot of these providers now, they are getting better and not just protecting themselves, they are trying to do that. So I mean, I just heard something the other day from Amazon, and we said about those, those buckets that are out there that had all this information. If you want to make something publicly available now in one of these Amazon buckets, it warns you about 4 or 5 times. I mean, you have to click through and be like, yes, I understand. Yes, I understand. And, agree. So they are making it even more difficult to accidentally do things, so which is good for everyone.
So the goal in doing this presentation for everyone today, one thing I can't stand in my personal life is when someone's trying to sell me something based on fear. And I don't want to say that we're using fear to promote anything here. We're not trying to sell anything. But what we're trying to do is just show that these things really do happen, and they happen on a regular basis, unfortunately. And since we've moved into the world, the COVID-based world, this is what's happened now since March, when the majority of the working world in the United States has gone to working remotely. 64% of people are now working remote. I'm currently sitting in my home office and working remotely. I have only been to my actual lab, I think 3 times in the last month. So I'm definitely one of the statistics in this. And that's an increase of 148% in working remotely since the pandemic started. And what we're seeing is that hackers are adapting to this in various ways, but one of the most popular ways is they're creating COVID-19 knowledge-based websites. And the interesting thing is several of them are actually very factual, and they update them on a regular basis. But what they're littered with is viruses and malware, especially, that move in and try to infect your systems when you go to those sites. Interesting statistic is adult content sites since the pandemic started has seen a 600% increase in traffic. Why I bring that up here is because the majority of adult content sites are riddled again with malware and different viruses. The security is typically not done very well on there, and so other threat actors can come in and inject their malware into adult sites, and they get the run of the mill of gaining access to lots of different accounts and lots of different computers through that method a threat actor would take. A 97% increase for personal use of managed devices. So that becomes kind of a policy within different organizations. Are we letting people go out to Facebook? Are we letting people access their Gmail from work, their personal Gmail, for example? And we're seeing more and more of that take place as well. An 80% increase in the use of collaboration apps. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone. But if we remember from several months ago, it was learned that Zoom was hacked, and it was what they called Zoom bombing, where people could just go into different Zoom meetings and conversations and sit and listen almost without being detected completely. And the last thing that is very concerning is we're now seeing cloud-based malware versus web-based malware increase at the rate of 63%. And in a couple data breaches that we've worked on so far this year, we're finding that the threat actor or the hacker, sorry to use my different terminology here, the hackers themselves are using cloud-based services to do all of their work. When they exfiltrate or take data from different organizations, they're moving it to an AWS bucket temporarily. They're moving it to a Dropbox and things of that nature. So just some statistics to keep in mind as we are working in a different environment than we were a year ago.
When you guys are answering that poll about how many cloud service providers does your organization have, one of the big things, when we were talking about those 2020 statistics, we talked to legal counsel a lot, and it was shocking the number more of cases of things with like Zoom and dealing with those kind of things that I've never even heard of, especially when it comes to schools and things like that. It was very interesting to hear some things that have never really come up until all of the 2020 have happened.
Correct.
So it looks like from, how many things, most people are in that 1 to 5 range. There's some people who have said they have no idea, which is fine and we can thing. The one thing I will say about a lot of these, how many service providers, kind of things like that in cloud you have out there, there's so many times we've gone to organizations and IT or leadership, there's things that they don't even know about. They term the code or name shadow IT, where it's I can go out now to websites and sign up for things, and maybe no one's unaware, kind of thing. So it does happen quite a bit. What we see a lot of times with organizations. So just we didn't want this to be a whole scary kind of thing. We do want to make it somewhat educational. So we do have some boring stuff I just want to go over with you guys, just sort of going over like what are a few things. So when we do say something about like what is cloud computing, a lot of people have termed this, it's magic. I don't have to do anything kind of thing. But simply put, cloud computing is the delivery of computing services like, storage, databases, networking, software over the internet. So, instead of the processing things you've done on your installing something on your computer, it is being done somewhere else and you're just accessing it over the internet. So when we say cloud computing, that's what we're talking about. And, obviously you really can't see this, which is it's fine. I wasn't really expecting. I just sort of want to show you the sort of the landscape of it. So when it comes to cloud providers, most people are like, oh yes, Amazon or Google and Microsoft. There are actually thousands of different, things that do databases and do streaming and do messaging or, all kinds of different things across the cloud. And if you guys are ever interested or bored, if you just Google the cloud native landscape, you'll just come up with this, and it's actually very interactive. You can click on all of these little tiles and it'll tell you exactly what it is. But there are tons of organizations that do certain things within the cloud, and it is just a big shift from installing things on computers. And what we've really seen is this is an exploding area. There are just so many different things. So it's not just Amazon, Google, Microsoft kind of things. And some basic terminology I just want to go over with you guys so people are aware of this. Maybe you know exactly what these are and things, but I just want to point a few of these out. So when someone does say like a public cloud, they're talking about resources, those are servers, storage that are sort of shared across the board. So you think of like, Google Drive kind of thing. It's, on the back end, Google is sort of is supporting all that hardware, all that software, and it's sort of shared across all kinds of organizations, so they're utilizing it that way. If it's a private cloud though, it's usually either in-house or it can be hosted by a Google, Amazon kind of thing, but it is dedicated hardware and software to a sole organization. So you're not, in the same on the same hardware as another company, kind of thing. So that's a private cloud. And when we talk about hybrid, we are talking about a mix of the two. kind of things. The hybrid cloud where we see big time is, we have a private and a public, is like a lot of times in healthcare. There are a lot of things we're like, hey, we can store it out in the public. It's not a big deal, but if it is something like HIPAA information, we want that to be private because we want to have a lot more control over it, so now we can control the hardware and things like that. So the next one, if you go the next slide, the containers. And I'm not going to go into too big detail of what a container is and things, but I do want to point out, because this is a big term now that comes up, basic level containers allow you to do more computing things on a single server. As you can see there, in the virtual machines, you might have an app and you have an operating system for each of them. In a container, you're really using one operating system to control many apps, kind of things. You can do different libraries, things like that. The big benefit of all this, and why a lot of organizations are going to this, is you can pack a lot more into a little bit. So you're obviously paying less for storage, less for memory, less for hardware, things like that. So obviously this is a big area to go to. And just as an interesting fact, Google generates more than 2 billion containers every week in their organization. So, I mean, these things are huge. And obviously Google is one of the largest companies in the world, but I mean, even small organizations, I mean, they're creating different containers that have different web apps, different things like that constantly.
The one thing, Matt, if I can jump in here, going back to the private cloud, I explained to someone one time that using the cloud, you're just using someone else's computer. And that being said, I had the opportunity one time to go to a private cloud warehouse where it seemed like a half a mile of servers. And they had different companies in there. They had Facebook, they had Sony, they had Google, they had different large, very well-named companies in there. And the security of that place was such that I couldn't find it on Google Maps. They had to give me physical directions like it was 1990. And when we were there, I had a very large, intimidating armed security officer come up to the automatic gate and make me show ID to get in. And as we walked around and I took a tour, I was there doing some consulting. This same very large armed security guard was usually about 5 yards behind us. So it's something that from a private standpoint, when these companies like Facebook and Google, when they outsource something like this, the security, not only the network and cloud security, but the physical security is taken very, very seriously.
And I've heard about that across the board. And we did have a question about, can you give an example of a container? So two things, which is not specifically a container, but you might hear the term Docker or Kubernetes. Those are frameworks that are built on all different container things, but usually a container is, if you do have like a web app, which maybe it's just on your website, it's just an intake form. You can sign up for certain things with it. A lot of times organizations have multiple versions of that. So, if you're in a different area of the country, you might see one versus others. Well, the great thing about containers is I can have multiple versions of that all in one container and not have to put different operating systems, have to have different things. They can all share the same library of code, things like that. And I can easily replace them without having to do a whole different dealing with, different operating systems or different libraries. They can share all of those kind of things. So that's just an example of where containers can really help an organization. So we're showing here the service catalogs, and I'm sure a lot of these are a little more familiar with people. I do like this diagram here. Most people, obviously on-premise stuff, you're talking about traditional IT where everything, the hardware, the networking, everything like that, you've done in-house. You have a data center maybe, everything's there. And then you have on the very opposite side on the right, a lot of times it's SaaS, you might hear it. It's a software as a service. And these are things, everything's sort of outsourced. You don't really have to do anything. Things like Salesforce is a big SaaS one where it's like, we don't have to update an application. We don't have to, update operating systems kind of thing. But then in between, we do have some certain things like infrastructure as a service. What that actually does is it allows a service provider to take care of some things like the servers and the networking. They manage that, so they worry about the physical power and all that. But when it comes to the operating system and the actual applications and things like that, that is the client has to maintain and control those. And the same thing with the platform as a service. They take care of a lot more of the things, which this is becoming more and more popular, where it's like, I don't have to worry about Windows updates. I don't want to have to worry about, keeping certain things up to date. I just want to manage my application. And what's great about those platforms is I can go in there and control a lot of the data. So I have access to the database. I have access to the application where I can do modifications if I want to make things look different or change views. That's all there. But obviously then you don't have to worry about doing a lot of those other things, which pay for hardware and keeping operating systems up to date and things like that. So those are the four different kind of catalogs, kind of things that you'll see when it comes to cloud computing. Well, three, and on premises, obviously everything's in-house. So it looks like we have another polling question here. Does your organization have a vendor review process which ensures vendors meet in specific security related criteria? So what we're just asking here is, when if you're going out to one of these, something like a Salesforce or AWS, do you guys have a written policy or procedure to deal with that, or anything like that?
And I think this is a really good question, simply because in the review of your security policies, like you said, Matt, this is one of those things that is commonly overlooked by small to mid-size organizations. It's, we have to worry about our own security, but we're not going to worry about our vendors. When a lot of times vendors will have access to different parts of your organization as a matter of convenience in working with them, and not knowing their security platform and their policies puts you just at risk, regardless of how much money you've spent on your own security.
Yeah, definitely.
Here's your results.
All right, and it looks like there's a pretty good split across all of them. And obviously the one that actually had the most was the no policy or procedures, which is, a little bit alarming, but it is what we see across most organizations. When we talk to them, they don't have something that's sort of formalized that outlines exactly, some criteria. A lot of times we talk to organizations like, hey, we rely on our contract, which, I always like to remind people, when you do go to a service provider, especially if it's something like a SaaS, you go out to any of these, Salesforce kind of things, they're not taking all of the, which we'll get into a little bit more detail here later. They're not taking the risk from you. You have to do sort of some due diligence, and you can see that in some of those breaches we talked about even earlier. They may have happened from a third party or something like that, but it was, Facebook's data. They were the ones that were ultimately responsible, so it still had to come out, and they had to be the ones to announce we had an incident. And we did have a question out there of, if we can give an example of the SaaS and infrastructure as service and a platform. So the SaaS is, and you can think about pretty much anything like a Salesforce or now I'm just mind blanking. NetSuite, any of those kind of things of different. It's just, everything's sort of out there. The infrastructure as a service is there's more of a Microsoft Azure kind of thing, where I can spin up certain servers. The hardware, obviously, we don't manage, Microsoft does, but the actual stuff, we can install different operating systems. So if you're like, hey, I want a certain flavor of Linux or anything like that, that'd be more the infrastructure. And then the platform as a service, again, it's more of a unique thing, and you can do these through Microsoft and different kind of service providers, but it's more of they handle the operating system. So they just give you a nice clean operating system that they keep up to date, and then you can go in there and build. Usually most organizations, platforms, they are building an application themselves that they can manage, because they want to have that ability to do that.
In relation to the polling question, I'd like to kind of give you a real life example that's actually taking place right now. We have a data breach that we're currently engaged in, and the company is, I'm just going to say they're a vendor to a number of other large companies. And this vendor has one IT person that is an outside person, and he's not an employee. And they didn't really have any security or policies in place. And there's 35 computers, and they're all kind of across the board as to what what computers there are. The operating systems are really across the board, but they've experienced a data breach, and we're working with them to figure out how it happened and how they got in, what information was vulnerable, what information was possibly taken, because there's a legal standpoint to it, and now they have to legally notify their clients. And them being a vendor, these are the people that keep them in business. So not only is this data breach costing this company a large amount of money, this one, the total cost on this to this company is going to run them, when it's all said and done, I'm going to say about $300,000 when this is completely done. That's not a bill that any manager or business owner ever wants to see, that he or she wasn't expecting. And as part of the notifications, they have to go to all of their clients now and say, we got breached and your data is at risk that we had in our system. There's a good chance that a lot of their clients may not be clients anymore. And that's nothing that anyone wants to see in any business of any type. So in understanding your vendors, and do they have their own security policies, and covering that whole thing is a very important thing, because again, a large company could spend $1 million a year on security, but if they're not asking their vendor if they have any type of security in place that meets their approval, what's the point of spending $1 million a year on it if you're not asking those questions?
Definitely. And, we were just tying that back to, and it comes down to a lot of due diligence with all of this. You need to, you may not have to know everything about security things, but you sort of just need to know enough to at least ask questions. And that's why we're sort of here today of educating, certain terms and things, is you should at least ask a lot of questions, either to, if you're, in leadership, to your IT department, or if you're outsource a lot of things to your third party vendors, you want to ask sort of some questions about, how things are being handled and how vulnerable you may have be.
Correct.
So just talking about some myths when it comes to moving to the cloud. I'm sure some of these you've heard before, and a lot of these do have sort of a caveat kind of thing, but the first one of moving to the cloud automatically saves you money. This is very true most of the time, but it can not be the case. If you go out there and a lot of these things you do pay by like how many services you have up or how long you have things running, and you can save money. We're like, hey, we can shut down things, at certain times of the year, maybe because we don't use them, which is why going to the cloud is great. But if you do leave things out there and just spin a lot of things up and start them up, they can add up quickly. Me personally, I was working in organizations before Eide Bailly, and we were thinking about going to the cloud. We wanted to test a few things. We went out to Azure. We spun up a few servers. We tested it. We're doing that, and we shut them all down. We thought, okay, that's great. We did it in a few weeks. We got our bill, great. And the next month, we still got a bill for, and I mean, it was very low amount. It was only a few dollars, but we could not figure out what it was or why, because we thought we shut everything down. But there are a lot of reoccurring things that it was like, hey, you guys, when you signed up, you chose to have an IP address dedicated to you. Well, even if you shut everything down, they still keep that on file, which they charge you every month. So something like that can start adding up. And you just sort of want to be aware of those before going in. So you really want to have a plan when you go to the cloud, instead of just be like, hey, we're just going to move everything out there and we're going to save a bunch of money. You do have to have sort of a plan. The cloud isn't safe for storing sensitive information. In the previous life, I worked in healthcare about 10 years ago, and that's when the cloud was really starting to pick up a little bit. And I will say at the time, our stance in the security was we're never putting stuff out there. We don't trust other people, but things have changed greatly. A lot of things are much better. They do have, things dedicated to certain things like healthcare information that you can pay a little bit extra and make sure there's security, a little more security involved. And what I usually tell people, and they say, cloud isn't safe. If you're a small organization, more than likely, and Trent had brought it up, about these physical security in these places are insane, and they do background checks. They're probably doing things better than a small organization will ever be able to do. So moving out there is probably much safer than trying to keep something in-house and, worrying about a server that's sitting in a public area that may get stolen or something like that.
In my former life, Matt, doing digital forensics in a law enforcement capacity, when I was a contractor to the FBI, we would always say there's no way that law enforcement digital forensics will ever move to the cloud. Well, then Amazon came up with a beautiful way for law enforcement to specifically store their data in the cloud. And the CIA uses it now, the FBI uses it, lots of state governments use it. So you never say never, because they have made it very, very secure.
Definitely. The next thing is, the transitioning to cloud is quick and easy. That I have personally have found that to be a complete lie. It's usually a little more difficult than you think. It is, there are a lot of things you forgot to think about, and B, just trying to get things and doing cutovers and getting data and getting things like that. It can be, sometimes it can be pretty quick and easy. A lot of times we just see organizations who are like, we're just going to transition to a whole new way of doing something. They're not just picking legacy stuff up and trying to stand it up in the cloud. It's like, we're going to go to a whole different product or something like that. And that's can be even add to the complexity with that sometimes. So I always reluctant when people are like, oh, we're going to have this done in a week. It's like, oh, okay, good luck. Well, I think it might take you a little bit longer, but it is something to remember. The cloud is difficult to audit. This was something that again came back from years ago when things were just starting. There really wasn't a lot of logs. There wasn't a lot of dashboards of things that showed you a lot of information. It was really hey, just come put your stuff out here and play around if you want. That has really changed, obviously, with compliance, and these companies want to deal with if whether it be any kind of sensitive information. They know that there has to be login, there has to be dashboards to know different key performance indicators and things like that. They want all that stuff readily available for clients. So I mean, a lot of times it's usually even better in the cloud than actually in-house. The one thing I always caveat, especially when it comes to logging and things, a lot of times some of those things aren't turned on by automatically. So even like in Office 365, so if you have that for your email, you do want to make sure you go out there and configure it to make sure certain things are being recorded, because I think usually by default they are changing a lot of things and they change rapidly. That a lot of different things are not enabled by default to record certain actions, maybe like logins and things like that. One thing too, in my previous life we were always afraid of is the cloud is an IT job killer. We were sitting there and everyone's like, oh, we're going to go to the cloud and we won't have to pay these people to manage all these servers and things. And I will say I have seen a little bit of turnover kind of thing. It's very rare. I think a lot of times just shifting roles instead of going to like, hey, we have to physically manage these things. We just sort of logically manage them now. Because a lot of times if organizations are going completely to the cloud, there are still things that need to be done. The one caveat I like to put with that is it is not exactly the same. So just because you might have a system administrator that has been, dealing with servers for 20 years and he's great, moving it right to the cloud, he won't have the expertise and all of the knowledge that he may need without getting some education. We've seen so many organizations have that issue where they're like, we have a sysadmin, he's been doing a great job, and when we move to the cloud, we just expect him to know everything, and it's just a different kind of skills. And most people do pick up on it, but you do have to think of different things than the traditional system administrator.
I think a good example of that, Matt, would be Amazon, AWS. They have different certifications to use AWS for system admins, whether it be in security or just administrative use. That there's knowledge out there that they need to gain in order to use it, because it's not just jump right into it, like you said.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing which we hear about a lot of times there too is the cloud should be used for everything. You know, there are cases for benefits of going and not. We do tell organizations you should really look at the risk and see, costs and things like that. But not all services, are best going moved right into the cloud. We see a lot of, manufacturers with like legacy and systems. Moving certain things to the cloud is going to be a nightmare. It would be very difficult. So, just thinking, hey, we need to move to the cloud is not always the answer, kind of thing. And
Yeah,
the last, go ahead, Trent.
I was going to say, the question you asked there obviously is the why do we need to move to the cloud?
Yes.
Is there a cost benefit to it in storing things in the cloud as opposed to, say, replacing our servers every 4 or 5 years? There's a lot of questions you would ask on, why are we moving to the cloud? Is it because everyone's doing it, or is there a fiscal responsibility to the organization that makes sense?
Yeah, and we see a lot of organizations sort of their reasoning isn't like a security or fiscal. I mean, it's pretty much just like, well, everyone's doing it, and It's usually not the best reason to do it, but sort of trying to think more of a lines of, is it going to make you guys streamlined? Is it going to make, fiscal sense? Things like that. Those are the questions you want to ask. And the last thing up there, the cloud providers will access my data. This was a big thing back in the day of people were afraid of, especially when it came to like,
Mhm.
healthcare, if you had proprietary information. So, if you're making, you know, patents, things like that, we were afraid that providers would be stealing your data. And obviously this is sort of a myth, Kings, because they're in the business to provide these services. And if they were caught doing any of this stuff, everybody would leave in droves. So they obviously have a lot of things in place to monitor their employees, things like that. And sometimes they have actually little things set up where you can set up where they have, it's almost very difficult for them to have access to your data. So it's very unlikely. I've never really personally have never heard of an incident in the least last few years that a cloud provider was accessing a customer's information inappropriately.
Yeah, I haven't either, actually, Matt.
So we were talking about some myths. So now let's just talk about some benefits. And I do have a little asterisk up there. Like to put the disclaimer in there. Results may vary, because and that's the same thing with some of those risks or myths that we talked about. There's good and bad to a lot of things. Flexibility. This is one of the biggest reasons why we see people go to the cloud. Those are great if you have resources that are very intensive. We see organizations, if it's like maybe something like in the publishing or it's tax, or there's certain times a year maybe that you obviously have a big spike. If it's something like retail, maybe that November December timeframe, your website gets a hit a lot more than the rest of the year. And what's great about going to the cloud is you have the flexibility to scale those things. So instead of, if you had everything in house and you're like, well, for those peak times we need to buy all these servers, and then the rest of the time they just sort of sit there and do nothing. But with the cloud, I can scale up or I can scale down really quickly. And, obviously if it's during a time that I don't need all that things, I'm saving money, which obviously goes into the next thing over the cost efficiency, the savings of, resources of having to buy hardware, or maybe just renting, facility space, or even just office space. Almost everywhere I've worked in the past, office space was like a premium. Every department in the world was fighting for office space. And if you're taking up a bunch of different closets for equipment and for IT equipment and things, it's taken away from some of those people who really need an office for certain things. And with the cost thing too, energy savings can be phenomenal. I was actually blown away. I actually didn't do any of this work, but I was working with a large university at the time, and they were very siloed. So they had obviously IT all over the place. So each department had like an IT. So they had little data centers all over the place. And they were just little closets, and they've determined that like between just the energy costs to be able to shut down those closets and move them to a central place or to the cloud, I mean, we were talking tens of thousands of dollars a year per room. I mean, and they had hundreds of them. It was really insane for when it comes to cost efficiency, because you have to cool all those rooms to keep them cool and have UPS backups for all of them. So it is sometimes very efficient to try to either go to the cloud thing to try to centralize all of that. Disaster recovery and business continuity. This is a huge thing, and this is why most organizations do. It used to be, if you had an in-house IT, you would try to get your backups. Maybe they were on tapes and they drove them to a different facility, or if you were lucky enough to have multiple facilities, you would send different backups across to each other. So, just in case a physical disaster happened, like, a tornado or a fire came and destroyed one of your facilities, you would have backups somewhere else. Sometimes small organizations don't have that luxury. And I personally have heard people who are like, oh well, our manager takes external hard drive and backs everything up, and she just takes it home with her. And we actually had a case where that happened, and she had it at home and her house got broken into and that hard drive was stolen. So they lost all their information when they were trying to do something good of having disaster recovery and have stuff saved off site. But with the cloud, you can obviously do a lot of different things where it's like, I can, have some things local. I can save up to the cloud. So if, we do have an emergency here and fire, I can spin things up in the cloud. And then what's great too, you can actually save them across multiple different cloud providers, or even within like Amazon. You can actually say, hey, I want to save it out on the East Coast, but I want to have copies of it also on the West Coast, just in case, something would ever happen to one of those data centers, kind of thing.
That was one of the big selling points when the cloud first came out, was the redundant backups across different, usually they talked about the power grids. In case a power grid went down in the West Coast, then we have your same data on the East Coast. So you always have access to your data.
Definitely. And, that's what we see, especially in uptime. And,
Mhm.
cross your fingers, we haven't had any of those large, northeastern whole states out without power kind of thing, but never miss updates. We talked about this earlier when we talked about different services, but the one great thing which we see constantly when we go into some of these organizations now is, hey, how's your guys' patching? Oh, we're really behind. We haven't done it in months, and I only do it whenever I think about it. Trying to keep things up to date can be very cumbersome. If you go to the cloud and do a lot of things, you can. I'm not saying 100% you don't have to worry about this, because there are cases where you might have to deal with them still, but something like a SaaS kind of thing, you don't have to worry about the updates. They do all of those kind of things for you. The payment flexibility, this works for especially small organizations, works really good, because if you did in the past, hey, I have to buy these servers, they can be extremely expensive. You're talking tens of thousands of dollars sometimes for putting up servers, and that's a one-time bill right up front. And granted, they'll usually last a few years kind of thing. But what's great about the cloud is, I am on a subscription base usually. It's sort of a pay as you go, kind of thing. So I'm not having to dump a lot of that money up front, which is, great for especially small organizations, because I don't have to write that check for $30,000 to buy a bunch of servers right up front. I can put in a few $100 and I can be up and running right away. Accessibility, we talk about, accessing for anywhere. That we talked about earlier about being remote, because everyone's working remote now, things. Just being able to access it without having to, set up VPNs and things like that sometimes is just can be very easy for everyone, and can be very beneficial across the board. Security, we've talked a lot about this. I'm not going to talk to even more, because we've talked about so much of different things already, of different things. But we always said, a lot of things do have things sort of baked in. They have the physical security taken care of. They have a lot of controls in place to have separation of duties. So you're not seeing certain people's information. They have a lot of stuff already baked in, which for small organizations, things that can be very beneficial, because they don't have the knowledge or the resources sometimes to know those kind of things. And the collaboration, it's sort of up there with accessibility. You can work from anywhere. We were just talking before this on the phone, and we're all sprawled out against different offices across the country, kind of thing. So we can all work together due to things like Zoom here, kind of things, which is always great. And the last piece is sort of that competitive edge. You know, having the ability to scale up or spin things up faster can be a huge competitive edge for a lot of organizations that we've talked to.
A nice thing with competitive edge, and this was prior to COVID, but I could upload certain documents to, I'll just say, a cloud hosting service, and I could go to my client's office, and we could look at them and review them. Let's say it's a report that I was writing in a legal case, and I can review those with the attorney that I'm working with, and we can make changes on the fly. Now I can grant him access to that same thing as well, and he can go in and make suggestions and questions that he has about that in real time, and we can collaborate, across the internet through this cloud service. It makes it very, very nice from my standpoint to work with him and him to work with me.
Definitely. So we have another polling question. We're just talking, does your organization track or monitor access to your cloud service providers? And this we were sort of hinting at earlier about, that shadow IT. Do you guys monitor to see if anyone goes out to, Dropbox or maybe Asana, which is a project management tool, to see, because what's great about those is I can just go out to the website and sign up. The bad piece is I may put sensitive information out there, and the organization might not know about it. So always interested to see if organizations, monitor any of those kind of things to see hey, is anyone going out and using Dropbox? When we said, hey, no one should be using that. They should all be using maybe OneDrive, since, you guys are a Microsoft shop and you have that already, the ability. Oh, so for the most part, for at least the leading pieces, it does, they do look like they block non-approved services, which is great.
That's good.
But we do still have like a quarter that says no, and it is wide open, which, you know, or they try, which we that's what we do see a lot of people are trying kind of thing. But for the most part, sometimes it is hard, and sometimes it just comes down to user education too. So some risk with moving to the cloud, we'll just cut down, so we're coming down on time here, just kind of things. But the big first one there, no mitigation, should be migration plan to go to the cloud. A lot of people are just like, hey, I have this spreadsheet or all this file servers, I'm just going to dump it out there, kind of thing. That's not usually the best idea, especially if you have an application or anything like that you want to do. We talked about some of those wasted costs. If you do spin things up and you're not utilizing, you're just sort of paying for nothing. Sensitive information, that's a big one. You just be aware that not all cloud providers and things like that are made for things. Things like Dropbox or Box, they do have specialized things for, hey, if I have healthcare information I want to put out there, they do have special things, but it's not everything. So you can't just sign up for the free Dropbox account and think I can put out the PHI out there because it's safe. They do have designated special areas that you have to sign up for, and things for certain things when it comes to sensitive information. So you do want to watch that issue. The lack of due diligence, we had really touched on that a bit too, but I just sort of want to push it on there. Sort of asking these questions when you're talking to a vendor. So if you are looking to go in something like, hey, we want to outsource, our HR program to one of these cloud things, so we don't have to worry about this database and things like that. That's great, but you just want to remember that due diligence. You want to ask those questions. How are you guys handle the information? Do you guys work with any fourth or fifth parties? A lot of times when we talk to organizations, we talk to the third parties that may be hosting some things for them and managing some kind of application, and then we find out they also have their own third parties, which would be your fourth and fifth parties, that they outsource to have access to your information. You sort of want to ask those questions, be like, you know are you aware of those? What kind of security requirements do you, and make sure that your third parties follow, things like that. You really want to ask those kind of questions up front. And we talked about too before about lack of knowledge. A lot of times too, you don't want to just rely on IT to know all of this stuff out of the box. You do want to make sure they get education and training on a lot of services if you are going to move, some of your infrastructure out to the internet.
Okay, so the reason behind all of this, the big thing that we always want to avoid is data breaches. And when I say avoid data breaches, I'm kind of cutting my own throat there because I work in the world of data breaches, but there's a lot of other things that I do to stay productive and keep my job besides data breaches. I would rather see a company be safe and work proactively with a guy like Matt in his the cyber security department that we have here, or another cybersecurity department, than to get a phone call on a Friday afternoon, which is typically when they come in, letting us know that they've had a data breach and they need us to jump into play and start working on these. Like I said earlier in the presentation, the current one we're working on, their total door cost, I estimated about $300,000 between notifications, legal. There was some other payments made, our fees. It becomes a very, very expensive thing, and it becomes very stressful to the business manager, the CEO, the business owner, and it causes a lot of bad PR depending on the type of company that you are in those notifications. So the point of all of this is data breaches are what we want to avoid. And again, it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. But you can make that when far distant in the future if some simple things are done that would push the hacker away to go find someone easier to work on. So lack of cloud security, that question I asked earlier, why are you to the cloud? It should be, why are you in the cloud? My apologies. Do you have proper cloud-based security? And does it align with your business objectives? Now, those are meetings where executives work with the IT department to understand why they're moving there and what needs to take place. and ensure that the threat model is kept up to date. Are you doing regular penetration testing? Are you doing regular vulnerability scans to make sure that as things change and updates are done, that things don't get tripped, that leave you wide open? And those should be done depending on the industry you're in. Some industries do vulnerability scans on a monthly basis. Some of them do them quarterly or annually, but they're not terribly expensive, if I'm not mistaken, Matt. Is that correct? Vulnerability scans are not?
It's and with everything you talk about data breaches, those preventative things are pennies compared to dealing with the breach.
Correct. And from an IT standpoint, it really gives your IT provider or manager a good idea of where things need to be changed, and really gives them a roadmap of how to secure everything for your organization moving forward. So this is my biggest one. I would probably work on about 70% less data breaches if companies and individuals within those companies would utilize multi-factor or two-factor authentication. Simply, it works like this. You log into an account, you put in your username, you put in your password, and it says, okay, great, we have your information, but we're going to send you a 6-digit code to your cell phone that you now have to punch in, and then we'll let you in to have access to the information. That right there would thwart the majority of threat actor hackers throughout the world. It's a very simple thing. It is typically available on any social media, and any major organization is going to have two-factor authentication. It's very, very, very normal for companies to offer that. What's not as normal is for people to take advantage of it and use it. So if there's one thing that you remember from what I said today, two-factor authentication is very, very easy to set up and saves a lot of headaches and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars for your company in the future. So account hijacking, cloud accounts are abnormally high in risk for this type of threat because a lot of companies just throw things into the cloud, as Matt said. Cloud hijacking data breaches can be severe, and they can lead to a lot of cost and embarrassment and a significant amount of loss of business. If a threat actor gains access to your cloud account, for example, and they have the ability to download everything from that account, they can potentially also delete everything from that account and hold your data hostage because you no longer have it. That's just one example. So again, knowing why you're moving to the cloud and making sure security works with your reasonings as you move forward. Insider threat, this is probably where I spend the majority of my time when I'm not doing data breaches, is chasing down the loss of intellectual property within organizations. Finding how data is exfiltrated from a server, from a computer, from a desktop, from a laptop, when a disgruntled employee leaves, or various other types of things. But this is where I spend the majority of my time in helping companies protect their intellectual property. And when they do have reason to believe that it's been stolen, tracking it down and proving it for lawsuits that tend to end up costing lots of money for them as well.
And with that too, and not just insider threat. I mean, we see tons of the incidents, especially with cloud and stuff, where we've talked to clients. It's not so much they were trying to steal the stuff, but they mishandled it. And I was just trying to work from home, so I emailed all this stuff to my personal email account. And of course, then the personal email account gets compromised, and we were unaware of it as an organization. So we have seen a lot of that too, where it wasn't so much I was trying to be malicious and take something, but I still did something wrong. And of course, most people aren't usually prone to come up and say, hey, I did this. They try to keep their mouth shut for as long as possible until you find it. But we do see a lot of that.
Yeah, I see a lot less of that. I'm usually proving that someone took data maliciously. So thank you, Matt.
And we do have time for just a few questions. I'm not sure if we have addressed everything in the Q&A box though.
So we did have one in there about, do we have any templates that we can share for start security procedures and policies? We don't really have exactly, a template kind of things, because all organizations are a little bit different. So we don't really have a template per se. There are a lot of, resources out there. I usually tell people, if you search around, you can find, if you're looking for a security policy, higher education, all that information is public. You can work off of those, but we do like to tell people you should really make sure you're creating something that's going to be good for your organization. Trent had said a couple times of, what works best for going to the cloud. Well, when it comes to just policies and procedures, you don't want to just take one off the internet from someone and be like, oh, we're gonna put this into place now, kind of thing, because it's not going to be fit your organization probably, and a lot of times it might be, not enough, or sometimes it might be overkill. If you're a small organization, you're probably not going to need as much policies, procedures as, a Fortune 500 company. So it can be very, dependent on the organization, its needs, and its industry, especially if there's compliance with like HIPAA or higher education or FERPA with education, things like that. And I think there's some other information out there of just, information about the difference between a platform as a service, infrastructure, and software as a service. So, and that's good for everyone.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
there's no other questions. I just want to thank everyone on behalf of Matt and Amy and myself for joining us today. If you'd like to reach out to either Matt or myself with any additional questions, here's our information.
Well, thank you all so much for attending, and thank you to our presenters.